Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. I'm knitting a pair of duck pond socks, and today I'd like to show you how to do the modified shadow wrapped short row heel that's used in this pattern. Although I'm using this heel in a toe up sock, short row heels are generally symmetrical. They can be worked the same whether you're knitting from the top down or from the toe up. Now, you may be wondering how the heel in this sock is different than a customary shadow wrapped short row heel. There are going to be two key differences. First, the heel is not worked completely in rows. Usually, when you knit a short row heel, you begin knitting across the heel stitches, and each row is one stitch shorter than the last, with a special turning stitch at the end of each row. For the second half of the heel shaping, each row is going to be one stitch longer than the last, and you resolve one turning stitch at the end of each row. The first part of this heel has that sort of short row construction, where each row is going to be one stitch shorter than the last with a turning stitch on each side. However, before shaping the second part of the heel, there are two rounds that are going to be knit around the entire sock. Adding those two rounds minimizes the potential for hold at the corners of the heels on each side. It will also give the heel slightly more length and height, which often can make it fit a little bit better. The second difference between this heel and a typical shadow wrapped heel is going to be the turning stitch at the end of each short row. For a normal shadow wrapped heel, that turning stitch is similar to a lifted increase. For this version, the turning stitch is more like a median or knit one below or purl one below increase. Let's get started. Before we begin, if you enjoy our videos, consider joining the pack and becoming a member of thechilidog.com for ad-free access to our entire learning library, priority support, and more. As we shape the first half of the short row heel, remember each row must end with a special turning stitch. In this case, it will either be a knit one below or purl one below increase. For the first right side row, I knit across to one stitch before the end of the heel. Then I make that turning stitch by working a knit one below increase. So instead of knitting into the stitch that's on my left hand needle, I'm going to insert my right needle into the stitch that's directly below it. From the front to the back, wrap my yarn, and then knit that stitch and pull the yarn through, and I'm leaving the stitch on the left hand needle and not dropping it off. Then the new stitch that I just formed gets slipped from the right needle over to the left, and I turn my work over to the other side. For the first wrong side row, I'm going to purl across the row until I get to one stitch before the end of the row. Then I make my turning stitch by working a purl one below increase. So instead of purling into the stitch that's on my needle, I'll be working through the stitch that's directly below. My right needle tip comes from the back to the front through that lower stitch. wrap my yarn and form the stitch by pulling the yarn back through. And again, I'm going to slip this new stitch from the right needle to the left needle, and then turn my work over. For the remainder of the first half shaping, I'll use those twin-like turning stitches where there's 2 stitches emerging from the same lower stitch as sort of landmarks. So on right side rows, I'll knit across until I get to 1 stitch before a twin, create my knit 1 below turning stitch by knitting a stitch through the stitch that's not on the needle, but that's 1 below. Wrap and pull the new stitch through, and then slip the new stitch from the right needle to the left, creating a new twin, and then turn my work over. Then on wrong side rows, I'll purl across to 1 stitch before the next twin, create my turning stitch by working a purl 1 below the next stitch. So I'm not going through the stitch that's on the needle. I'm inserting my needle through the one that's just below it. Purl and pull the new stitch through, and then slip that new stitch from the right needle back to the left and turn. And I'll continue that process until a third of the stitches on each side of the heel are the twin-like structure, and a third of the stitches at the center of the heel are regular single stitches. Now, before shaping the second half of the heel in rows, I'm going to work a couple rounds around the entire sock to minimize the potential for holes at the corners of the heel and to add a little length and height to the heel. I'll be resolving or decreasing the twin stitches on each side when I meet them. However, it will be important to know where those single stitches at the center of the heel are. So as I begin working in rounds, I'll place a marker before those center heel stitches. Then I'm going to knit across the center single heel stitches. And then I'm going to place a second marker. As I knit around the rest of this side of the heel, I'll work a slip knit pass decrease at each of the twin-like structures. So I'll slip a stitch knitwise, knit a stitch, and then lift the slip stitch, pass it over the top of the stitch. So slip knitwise, knit, and pass the slipped stitch over. When I reach the side of the heel, I can rotate and then work across the instep stitches in pattern. At the end of the instep, I'll rotate. So I'm working the heel stitches again. And on this side of the heel, I'm going to resolve those twin-like structures by working them as knit 2 togethers. So I'm just going to knit each of the stitches in those twins together. And I'll continue doing that until I reach the first marker. When I reach that first marker, all of the twin stitches on the heel have been resolved and they're single stitches again. I'll slip my marker, knit to the next marker, slip the marker, knit to the side of the heel, when I reach the side of the heel, I'll rotate and work in pattern one more time across the instep. At the end of the instep, I rotate to the heel side and I'll knit across until I reach the second marker. Now we're ready to shape the second half of the heel in rows. Just like before, each row will end with our special knit or purl one below turning stitch. But this time, each row will be one stitch longer than the last. To start, I'm going to remove that second marker. I'm not going to need it anymore. And I'll make my turning stitch by knitting into the stitch below, slipping that new stitch from the right to the left, and then turning my work over. On the wrong side, I'm going to purl across until I get to the marker. I'll remove the marker, and again, I'm not going to need that one anymore either. So I'll just slide those out of the way and make my turning stitch by purling one below the next stitch. Slip my new stitch from the right needle to the left, and then turn my work over. From this point, we'll be using those twin-like turning stitches as landmarks again. For every right side row, I'm going to knit across until I get to the twin, resolve the twin stitch with a slip knit pass decrease. So slip, knit, and pass that slip stitch over, and then make my next turning stitch with a knit one below. Slip the new stitch from the right to the left and turn. On all my wrong side rows, I'll purl across to the twin, resolve the twin stitch by working a purl two together decrease, and then make my next turning stitch by purling one below the next stitch. Slip the increased stitch from right to left, and turn your work over. Continue in this manner between the two twin stitches until you've worked across all the heel stitches and there's a twin-like structure in the last stitch on each side of the heel. Now it's time to begin working the rest of the sock in rounds. So we'll begin by knitting around the heel stitches until we reach that twin at the side. At the side of the heel, we resolve that twin by working a slip knit pass decrease. Rotate our work and then work in pattern across the instep stitches. At the end of the instep, we rotate, work around our heel stitches, and we can resolve this final twin stitch by working a knit two together and then knitting across the remainder of the heel stitches. At this point, the heel shaping is complete, and you continue working the rest of your sock, in this case, the leg of my sock, in pattern. I hope you enjoyed learning how to work a modified, shadow wrapped short row sock heel. If you'd like to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechilidog.com and look for our duck pond socks. Until we stitch again, happy knitting.